We'll start on time. All right. We'll go ahead and get started. Hey, Rob. So welcome to the session today. If you're planning to attend rapid cycle evaluation, helping state and local policymakers make good decisions, you're in the right place. And if you're just lingering from lunch, you're welcome to sit in and listen to these fabulous presenters. I just wanted to kick it off a little bit and just share with you, this is a really hot topic. It's of high interest to states, and it's really exciting work. And we have three fabulous presenters here that will kind of enlighten you guys. And I think I know them all pretty well, and they're all great translators. They're smart people and are very thoughtful about this kind of work, but they're also add rigor to the work, but they're also exceptional translators of the information and making it relevant to the state and local levels. So just with that, I want to just briefly introduce each of them, and we'll go in this order of the presentations. Scott Cody is the Vice President of Mathematica Policy Research. He is a national expert in SNAP policy and has done a lot of work on modernization. He is passionate these days about rapid cycle evaluation, and he is really taking this to the next level, and we're excited about some of the work he's doing. Alex Resch is our second presenter. She's a senior researcher at Mathematica Policy Research, and she does most of her work is in education. She, along with her colleagues at Mathematica, have just recently developed a toolkit for state and for the Department of Education, focusing on what's called opportunistic experiments, and it's very exciting work. It's using, well, I'll let her go into detail around it, but it's producing high quality evaluation using existing administrative data and taking program of policy changes the opportunity to embed in it experiments along the way. And we're very excited about some of the work she's doing. And then finally, Angela Rachidi, and I hope I pronounced that correctly. She's the Deputy Commissioner for the Office of Evaluation and Research with the New York City's Human Resources Administration. I had to read that off there because it's so good to make sure I got it right. She is, I've worked with Angela and known her for a lot of years, and she's just an exceptional researcher and a good thinker about this kind of work. And she's going to pull in some examples of experiments that they've been able to do in New York City. And really, she's a wealth of knowledge in terms of bringing together the program side and the research side to do evaluation to really figure out what works. So we're very excited about this panel today, and I will kick it off. Scott, you're up.
Thanks, Michelle. I think that's the first time I've been described as passionate about rapid cycle evaluation, but maybe it applies. So there we go. Great. So as the first presenter, what I want to do is spend a little bit of time defining what we mean by rapid cycle evaluation. I will sort of get into the somewhat academic distinction between what we mean by rapid cycle evaluation and opportunistic experiments. And then I'm going to talk a bit about sort of conceptually about using rapid cycle evaluation as a tool to gain better understanding about how clients and programs like SNAP, which I'm very familiar with, TANF and other programs, get a better understanding about how they respond to regulatory changes that are debated constantly in Washington and in the states. As Michelle said, rapid cycle evaluation is sort of a hot topic right now in policy circles, and a big reason why that is it's used increasingly in the private sector by firms like Capital One, Facebook, Google, Subway sandwiches. These firms are using rapid experiments, running dozens, hundreds, thousands of experiments a year, testing changes to their products and services and their manufacturing processes and so on, trying to identify those that have a positive impact on sales, on revenue, on operating efficiency, so that they can adopt those and dispense with the ones that don't have an impact. And what the private sector values in this type of experimental approach to decision making is the causal inference you can make from typically a random assignment design when you're testing these operational changes. The random assignment design allows the private sector companies to quickly identify what actually is working and dispense with the things that aren't working. The thinking now is that in the public sector, as our program data has improved, we have more data, we have higher quality data, that we can start making these sort of experimental operational decisions in a relatively quick fashion and at a relatively low cost. And so that's why it's popular today. There we go. So I want to begin by contrasting rapid cycle evaluation with traditional program evaluation. I'm asked a lot, what's the difference? Does rapid cycle evaluation replace traditional program evaluation? The answer is no, it doesn't replace traditional program evaluation. The answer is they really use similar methods, but they're answering very different questions. So in traditional program evaluation, we're answering the question, does the program work? Do participants in this program do better than participants not in the program, either in no program at all or in competing programs? And to do that, we're using typically rigorous research methods like random assignment or regression discontinuity to compare people in the program to people not in the program. And the rigorous methods here are key. They give us confidence that the only difference between the individuals who are in the program and those not in the program is the program itself. Then we can attribute any differences we see in the outcomes to the program. And so that gives us a high degree of certainty that if we see an impact, it's due to the program. Rapid cycle evaluation uses similar research techniques, but we're answering a very different question. Can we make the program better? Does this change to the program improve outcomes for participants in the program? So again, we're using these rigorous techniques. We're comparing, instead of participants to non-participants, we're comparing some program participants, those with the change, to program participants that don't have the change. The thinking is that you can do this iteratively to identify those things that work and adopt them and dispense with the things that don't work. And over time, if you do enough of these sort of cyclically, iteratively, you'll improve the program performance so that the next time you go to do a program evaluation, you'll see even bigger impacts relative to alternatives to the program. So the big distinction between rapid cycle evaluation and opportunistic experiments, in my mind, and Alex can comment on this as well when she talks, is opportunistic experiments are using administrative data like rapid cycle evaluation. There just don't need to be the outcomes in opportunistic experiments don't necessarily need to be short-term, whereas in rapid cycle evaluation, we're often looking at short-term outcomes, trying to identify things relatively quickly. And what was the other one? They don't need to be short-term, and they don't need to be iterative. Thank you. So that's kind of the main difference between rapid cycle evaluation and opportunistic experiments. Otherwise, we're really talking about very similar methods. This slide contrasts rapid cycle evaluation with traditional program evaluation on the left, and the tools that are used pretty frequently by programs to assess the impact of policy changes now, which is basic performance monitoring and piloting. So if a program will identify some basic performance measures, monitor them over time, implement a program change, and then see if the performance measures improved after you implement the change. Or they may pilot the changes in some locations and see if the outcomes in that location do better than outcomes in the other locations. And the challenge with this type of analysis is that you can't disentangle the impact of the program change from other things that are going on at the same time. So if a program's participation rate is falling and you implement a change to try and improve that participation rate, if you implement a change to try and improve that participation rate, if the participation rate level's off, it's very hard to tell whether that change is due to or whether that impact is due to the change that you implemented, or if the participation rate was going to level off anyway. So that's what I mean when I'm talking about having a clean test. The rigorous methods behind rapid cycle evaluation give you a clean test of the thing that you're changing, the thing that you're testing, and wow, I've totally lost track here. We'll give you a clean test of the thing that you're changing with these rigorous methods. Rapid cycle evaluation will also give you real-time information like performance monitoring. You can identify, you can inform decisions relatively quickly. So let me ground this with some real-world examples of rapid cycle evaluation. So we have a study with the U.S. Department of Agriculture. This is a study looking at the impact of the eligibility interview for the SNAP program. So for the SNAP program, regulations require that all applicants go through an eligibility interview. In most states, this eligibility interview is done, over the phone these days. In Utah, we are testing eliminating the interview altogether. So a portion of applicants to the program are randomly assigned to have no eligibility interview. We are using essentially rapid cycle evaluation techniques to test whether the impacts of I have to get my language right. So we are using rapid cycle evaluation techniques to test whether individuals who have an eligibility interview have different outcomes than individuals who don't. So about 20% of the individuals who apply for the program do not get an eligibility interview. They apply online. Utah is able to verify the information that they provide online through third-party databases. If they have questions, they can call the individual and get additional information. But if the person is eligible, they're automatically enrolled in the program. What this study can tell us is whether the eligibility interview improves the quality of the data that the individuals provide. Are individuals who have an eligibility interview, are they more likely to report lower income? Are they less likely to claim deductions that they might be eligible for but don't recognize or don't realize? Are they less likely to continue through the application process because they don't have that help of an eligibility worker? So through this sort of experimental technique, we're able to have a much better estimate of the effect of the eligibility interview. You can also use rapid cycle evaluation to test nudges and changes in communication. If you want to change the language in letters to clients or change the language on your website to try and improve the quality of the information that you receive from clients, or if you want to change the way that clients behave and interact with the program, you can test these types of changes. You can test whether using text messages to communicate with clients can encourage them to participate more in program services. You can use rapid cycle evaluation to test differences in the targets and expectations that you provide clients. So changes in requirements around work-related activities. You can test different levels of expectations for work-related activities to see if they have an effect on program participation. You can also use this to test changes in the expectations for performance measures for eligibility workers or for program staff. If you want to use a different level of performance standard, test the different levels of standards and see if that has an impact on the efficiency of staff and the quality of the information that staff provide. And then finally, you can use rapid cycle evaluation to test the impact of different regulatory changes. I'm going to skip this slide because I think Alex is going to cover some of that. So what my argument here is that rapid cycle evaluation can be used to give us a better sense of how clients respond to the types of regulatory changes that are debated in Washington and in states. And when these types of changes are considered, there's often a lot of debate. Will this change increase program participation or not? Will this change increase participation in the labor force or not? Will this change improve the efficiency of the program and reduce operating costs? Will this change reduce the quality of the data that we get from clients and lead more clients to have the inappropriate benefit amount, basically reducing program integrity? So there's often a lot of speculation and debate about these changes. And my argument is that rapid cycle evaluation can be used to give us a better sense of how clients respond. And going forward, we can make better informed decisions about which policy levers to change to achieve a certain program outcome. So the types of regulatory changes I'm talking about here, when you're thinking, I'm thinking a lot about the SNAP program. If you're thinking about the deductions in terms of the eligibility rules, the deductions from income when you're applying for benefits. I put this up here because this was one of the debates in the last Farm Bill that was passed in January, as the Farm Bill included a change in effectively the number of people who can claim a deduction for heating and cooling expenses. Rapid cycle evaluation could actually be used to give us a really good estimate of the impact of that type of change. You can also test changes to verification requirements. What types of documentation do you need to provide to verify the income that you have? Does changing this documentation lead to higher quality data? Does changing the documentation requirements lead to more costs for administering the program? You can change reporting. You can test changes to reporting requirements, how often clients must report changes in income, and what's the minimum change in income that they must report. You can test changes to the length of certification periods. You can test changes to requirements around work-related activities. What I want to talk about now is how we currently anticipate the effects of changes to many of these programs. For programs like the SNAP program, the TANF program, and others, oftentimes we're using simulation models to estimate what the expected impact of these changes are. Simulation models will apply program rules to administrative data and to survey data, simulate a change in the program rules and estimate how many people will be affected. And these models include behavioral assumptions about how people respond to different, changes in benefit amounts. And historically, it's been very difficult to validate those behavioral assumptions for some of the same reasons that I was talking about. If you simulate a change and you come up with an estimated impact, and then you implement that policy change, it's often hard to tell, and then you observe a change in participation as a result of that policy change. It's hard to tell how much of that change in participation is due to the policy change versus other things that were going on at the same time. So historically, it's been hard to validate the behavioral assumptions in these models. What I'm suggesting is that the federal government and state governments can do more to effectively do what New York City is doing, and Angela will talk about this in a bit, to promote the expanded use of rapid cycle evaluation opportunistically, sort of intentionally, so that we can get a better sense of the impact of these regulatory changes on client behavior. We can then use that information to generate better estimates going forward when we're considering policy changes, get better information about what the expected impact of those policy changes are. There's certainly some reason to be reluctant to use random assignment when we're talking about the eligibility rules for means-tested programs. And random assignments actually, so you don't want two individuals who are effectively the same to be subject to different eligibility rules. Random assignment is not the only design that you can use in rapid cycle evaluation. Regression discontinuity also could be used. Effectively, people below a certain income limit are subject to some set of eligibility rules, while people above the income level are set to a slightly different eligibility rule. That type of design can sort of constrain some of the inference that you can make from the analysis, but it will still provide very valuable information about the effect of that policy reform. You can use rapid cycle evaluation to test these reforms, not only to get an estimate of the impact of the reforms, but also to quickly identify any unintended consequences of the reforms. I think that we see often with a lot of hindsight that there are unintended consequences of some of the policy changes that we make. Using this type of experimentation, we can identify those a little more quickly, and then you can incorporate the results of these rapid experiments into future simulation models to get better estimates of what the impact of future reforms will be. So with that, let me turn it over to Alex.
Oh, that is the wrong slide. So I think there. Excellent, thank you. So I'm Alex Resch from Mathematica. I'm going to talk about, as Scott mentioned, I'm talking about opportunistic experiments, which are very similar to rapid cycle, have a lot of overlap, but I do think one key difference is that opportunistic experiments, the way we've been thinking about them, don't necessarily have to be fast. And so, as Michelle mentioned, most of my work is in education, and so this work that I'm going to present about comes from some work we've been doing for the Department of Ed about encouraging states and localities to think about generating rigorous evidence sort of as part of their normal practice, sort of creating a culture of learning in these agencies that maybe isn't there right now. And so the way we came at this question is very different than, like we're also aware of sort of like Google's testing things all the time. Why can't we test things all the time? But the way we were looking at this is that I'm an economist, and a lot of interesting studies by economists are natural experiments. And so when I think about natural experiments, if I pick up a paper, it's typically going to be there was a policy change, and it's already happened in the past. But there just happens to be that the way this policy was rolled out or the way it applied to people, it creates a group of people who were affected by this policy, and then a group of people who were expected not to be affected by this policy. And so if you can identify those two groups, look at them and say they're reasonably similar, you can make some inference about how the policy was working. And so what the opportunistic experiment is trying to do is take it a step backwards and say, when you're planning that policy change, let's put in there some random assignment so that we actually can make stronger causal inferences about the effects of these programs. So I'm going to start by sort of introducing opportunistic experiments and defining exactly how I'm talking about them. Then I'm going to talk mostly about sort of recognizing opportunistic experiments, and then go through a few challenges that we see when trying to bring states and localities on board, or really anyone you're trying to convince to participate in a study. A lot of these concerns come up. But basically the starting point here is that there's a big push. Everybody is in favor of evidence-based decision-making, but a lot of times states and local governments feel like there isn't actually evidence that's applicable to what they're doing, or they feel that evaluations that they're familiar with are big and costly and imposed from outside. And so what we're trying to think about here is opportunities for states, for smaller entities basically, to be generating evidence as the normal course of business. And so thinking about the education example, maybe a superintendent knows that their students aren't doing that well in math, but they don't know there's a series of new curriculums out there that vendors are trying to market to them. There's actually no good evidence on them. How do they make a decision? So they typically, just make a decision. And often they may pilot a program in a set of schools. And the set of schools they piloted in might be the 3 schools with principals who are very easy to work with. And so after a year, they think it's going well. And they decide to roll out that program, that curriculum everywhere, and find out that it doesn't work in the other 30 schools. And the reason is that, it worked with a really, vibrant principal who knew how to get their teachers to try something new, and it doesn't work when you roll it out to everyone. And so what we're trying to promote is the idea that that superintendent in that same situation could instead choose randomly from the set of possible schools. Then when you look at the outcomes a year later, you actually will have a better sense of how this program would work if you rolled it out everywhere. So when we've defined opportunistic experiments here, we're thinking of a randomized control trial that takes advantage of a planned intervention or policy change. And so that's the opportunity. There's an opportunity, you're already doing something, and so it's an opportunity to stop and think about whether it's possible to add a rigorous evaluation on top of what you're already doing. And so a step beyond that, though, typically these experiments will have some other characteristics that make them less disruptive. So the first thing is that it's planned. It's a planned intervention. Whoever is doing this is planning to do it anyway. So you don't have to pay or convince them. You don't have to pay for the intervention. You don't have to convince them to participate in it. They already want to do it. A second key feature is that it's not disruptive to the people who are participating. So I have participated in a number of large national random assignment evaluations in schools, and you have to spend a lot of time and energy convincing first a superintendent to listen to you and think it's a good idea, then the principals convince the principals that they want to do this new thing and that it's worthwhile for you to randomly assign students to their classrooms and then also come in and test them again. And so for an experiment to be opportunistic and to sort of get a lot of buy-in from the state and local entities who are participating in it, it really pays for it to be not disruptive. And so one of the other features that's common then is that there already is data about the key outcomes. So Scott talked a lot about using administrative data, and so situations where you can use administrative data are perfect. In school context, it's typically test scores, either the state test that students are taking every year anyway, or maybe there are some sort of benchmark regular tests that students take on a monthly basis. So something that already exists. You're not imposing an additional step of new tests, new assessments. And then the final thing is a strong partnership between researchers and implementers. And so this, I think, is critical to most research, but it's particularly important in this setting where you're trying to make research a part of normal behavior. And so this, in some cases, the entity has the research office. So Angela is a good example of that. But in other cases, it might be that, you're in there's a local university that has researchers who are very interested in, your education system or your human services. And so you can build a relationship so that there's someone thinking about how would we evaluate this side while you're thinking about how do we make this better. So as I mentioned, what I'm talking about is based on work we've just done for the Department of Ed IES. And so these are the covers of two papers. The one on the left is a longer guide that's targeted more at sort of state governments or policymakers about recognizing and conducting opportunistic experiments. And that one's already out at the Department of Ed's website. And then the one on the right is a much shorter paper targeted more at maybe principals, or maybe something principals could give to their teachers to convince them that this is a good idea, and that'll be out next week. And this is work with two co-authors at Mathematica, Jill Burke and Lauren Akers. So this is sort of the overarching theme here. So the dark steps at the bottom, these are steps that are part of every research project. And so the steps at the top are the ones I'm going to focus on. And I think, although you have to go through all these steps, I think at least in the context of convincing school districts and state education agencies, we really are in step one at this point. And we really have to, we're really at the very beginning of sort of getting people to think about what do we know and what don't we know, and how do we evaluate things on a regular basis. And so these steps, you'll see that they're sort of arranged in a circular fashion here. I think these all go together. They're not, and they're continuous. So I'm going to start with develop a research agenda, but it really is a constant process. So I think the first step is to think about what do you know and what do you need to know. And this doesn't have to be a formal sort of document that you're saying, I want to know X, Y, and Z over the next 5 years, but it's more about just sort of as a practice, getting your colleagues to be thinking about, like, we think this program is working, but we're not really sure. Or we want to make this change, we think it's going to be better. Do we actually know that it's better, or do we just think it's going to be better? And then, so the next step is to be thinking about opportunities for experiments. So once you're thinking about a policy change, the next slide, I think, is going to give some sort of keywords that are triggers that you're likely to maybe have an opportunity here. So I'll talk about those in a little bit more. And then the third part of this step one is identifying a research partner. So as I mentioned before, this might be a local, an agency could have a research office. A state education agency will tend to have some research folks. Large school districts have some research folks. Or it might be a relationship with a university or people like us. And so I think but it's important to be thinking about the ideas and what you're changing early in the process so that you can get the research started. So these are sort of some examples, both of opportunistic experiments that have been done, but then also sort of the keywords that should trigger someone to say, wait, can we study this? So one is excess demand. So the example here is an in-demand training program. Say you're a human services agency and you're trying, there's a program that people are really excited about, lots of people want to do it, you just don't have the capacity to serve everyone at once. If you already need to restrict access to this program, some people are going to get it and some people aren't. Maybe some people are going to get it right away and some people will get it later. Then that's an opportunity to assign those slots randomly instead of just giving them first come, first serve, for instance. Another example in that category is charter school lotteries. So there have been lots of studies of charter schools, which are rigorous, good causal studies, because the assignment to those slots was assigned randomly. In cases like that, it's important to, in any research, but here too, you do need to be cautious of what exactly you're studying. So in the case of the charter school lotteries in particular, those studies only exist for schools that are oversubscribed. Maybe the schools that have a long list of people who want to come in are different than the schools that don't have a long waiting list. And so you have to be cautious that you're providing evidence about a particular in-demand program. But if you're a city with those schools in your district, or you're human services agency with a particular program that's in high demand, that's exactly what you do want evidence about, so it can be very helpful. Another is limited resources, and so this example, I believe it was Maine, was considering rolling out a new intensive assessment to clients coming into one of their human services agencies, and they were thinking about doing this really intensive assessment of the client's needs. And so this would be a big change from what they were doing. It would take a lot of time, and so they just didn't have the resources to do this for everyone from the start. And so this would be a case where they could try to roll it out in a few sites or roll it out sort of, so create a random list, and if a client came in sort of in that order, they would either be assigned to the traditional way of doing things or the new intensive assessment. Another sort of keyword is a pilot test. If you're going to pilot something, that means automatically that you're going to do it in some places and not others, and so you can just assign that randomly. And then the final example, centralized communications, is one that Scott talked about. And so this is probably the most opportunistic of opportunistic experiments, and it's also one that fits best in the rapid cycle framework, where you're just tweaking a message. You're already communicating with a set of people, and you're just not sure if you're communicating in the most effective way. And so if you just try a different language, or there's an example of Virginia, the state, tried a study like this communicating about the availability of EITC benefits to their residents. And they tried a couple of different ways, either communicating just by a letter and a phone call, and were able to figure out what was the most effective way to use their limited resources to communicate with their residents. So then the next step is assessing the feasibility of the research project. So this is also common to any research. Really, you should stop and say, is this really going to work? But I think in this context where we're potentially working with folks who aren't commonly doing research, it's important to slow down and sort of just think hard about whether this is a good opportunity or a weaker one, because a poorly planned experiment can be counterproductive. And especially when this early stage of sort of convincing people to come along on this process, I think it's important to try to target and do, likely to be productive studies, and you don't want to be perceived as sort of wasting people's time. So the first thing is sort of the theory of change. And again, this doesn't have to be a very formal document. You don't have to actually draw out a logic model. But I think it's important to say, what are we changing here, and how do we expect that it's going to work? And then you can start thinking, then you see the rest of the pieces fall from that. What are the outcomes we want to look at, and when are those going to be available? Who is eligible for this change, and how do we have access to them? When would we be able to randomly assign them? What's the point at which we interact with them? And then these, I'm going to skip this. I'm going to go over this slide very quickly because this is, these are steps that happen in any research. I do think that in an opportunistic experiment, some of these tend to be easier than in a, sort of externally imposed evaluation. So in particular, your sites and your participants might be fully defined up front. If it's communications, it's the set of people who get this communication. You don't need to go convince anyone to participate with you. Often the random assignment can sort of happen behind the scenes. It's that the communications document is a good example of that. That's totally done by whoever is sending out these communications. Nobody has to know that there's random assignment. The data, presumably you'll be collecting some sort of interaction, some sort of response from that communication, and so you're already getting that information. And then the analyzed data and report findings is going to be common to everything. I think this is one place where it might be harder in an opportunistic experiment, is if the state or the locality, they don't really have the same incentive that an academic or an independent researcher has to report the findings and sort of make them public. But I think if we want this to be helpful to the community at large and a way of generating evidence, we do need to try to encourage folks to share what they're finding. So now I'm just going to talk about a couple of key challenges that we see especially when trying to convince sort of people who aren't used to doing rigorous studies to do rigorous studies. And so the first key challenge is just building support for random assignment. I hear this a lot from schools. It's not fair to not give someone this opportunity that everybody else is getting, or this student needs to get the best teacher. It's not fair to put them in the other classroom. And so I think the key argument that we see, or that we use, is that in the case where someone is going to get this and someone isn't, random assignment is a very fair way to distribute resources. And so in the cases of excess demand or limited resources, piloting, this is as fair a way as any other. Another challenge is accommodating people who must be in the program. So another example of a successful opportunistic experiment was a school district in Oregon had a summer reading program for readers, like children at high risk of reading problems. And they thought it was working very well. They wanted to try rolling it out to sort of students who were at less risk. And so, in this situation, you can imagine people being very upset at the idea of using random assignment because some of these kids really need these services. So in this case, the low readers are going to get the services no matter what. They'll be in the program, they just won't be in the study. And this can be done in any study. You can exclude certain participants. If someone feels very strongly that they should be in or out, you can exclude them from the study. They can be whichever group they need to be, and that's fine. You just need to sort of recognize that the more exemptions you have, the less rigorous your design might be. If you exempt half the population, you might not be able to say anything useful. Then my last key challenge here is looking at long-term outcomes versus quick decisions. And this sort of gets at the tension between the rapid cycle and opportunistic. Sometimes what a school district is really worried about is getting their students through college. We won't know this year if that works. We won't know next year if something works. But you can still sometimes build evidence that would be useful in these issues. And so in this case, the keys would be looking at short-term outcomes or intermediate outcomes that might be related to the ultimate outcome, or the other thing would be to collect IDs that could allow for long-term follow-up. Potentially a school district could do something in the short term and then look up these students in the National Student Clearinghouse 4 or 5 years down the road and be able to find out what they want to know. That wouldn't be rapid cycle anymore, but it still could be sort of useful evidence to this district. All right, now I'll hand it over to Angela.
Hi, everybody. Good afternoon. So as Michelle in her introduction mentioned, I'm Angela Rachidi, and I direct the Research and Evaluation Office for the New York City Human Resources Administration. I'm just going to shorten that to HRA for the rest of my presentation. And I just want to thank my colleagues from Mathematica for asking me to join their panel. So rapid cycle evaluation is not necessarily a term we always use at HRA, but it's something that we definitely use and have been doing for a number of years now. And so what I'm going to talk about this afternoon is just how we really implement rapid cycle evaluation in New York City, and then to give an example of how we have done it and to try to provide some practicality to what we're talking about today. So just a quick overview of what I'm going to talk about, a little bit of background, and then as I just said, describe rapid cycle evaluation at HRA, provide one particular example, although I have a couple others if it comes up during the question session, and then just to talk about sort of how it works with our program managers and how sort of it works within the culture of our agency, and then finally some lessons learned in doing this type of work within our agency. So just a little bit of background. New York City Human Resources Administration, it is, if not the largest, one of the largest social service agencies in the country. The three main programs we operate are TANF for cash assistance, the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, and Medicaid services. So at any point in time, there's about 350,000 people receiving TANF for our state cash assistance program, 1.8 million receiving SNAP, and 3 million Medicaid. So we have a very large population, which explains why we have a lot of staff. So we have 14,000 staff, 20 program areas, and what that has allowed HRA to do is we do have an internal evaluation and research team. It's small, I have 5 research staff, but our sole function is to do program evaluation and research activities for the agency. Most of our work focuses on the TANF Cash Assistance Program and SNAP, and all of the programming that goes in, along with that. And we also do sort of the support areas around those programs, so child care, child support, things like that. So this graphic just sort of illustrates the rapid cycle evaluation process at HRA. And really it starts with kind of a pilot program or a policy change. As Scott mentioned, when we're doing a lot of our rapid cycle evaluation work, it does start with sort of a regulatory change or a tweak in some sort of process, an operational process change. Usually it's initiated by the program area or some, officials that are making some sort of a major policy change. The next step is really collaboration. The evaluation team is brought in from the very, very early stages of planning, whatever the pilot or the change is. We attend most planning meetings. There's always, an evaluation item on the agenda so we can talk through what the evaluation is going to look like. Then that's still a lot of collaboration at that point. Really the third step is where my team kind of takes the responsibility for developing the evaluation. We come up with a plan, we figure out the design. We're working with the program areas to make sure it meets their needs, but really that's our area of expertise and we present that back to the program area. And then finally, in terms of discussing the findings, I think, and I'll talk a little bit about what's important in the rapid cycle evaluation sort of model, but it's really having interim feedback points. So when I say discuss finding, it's providing a lot of interim points of here's the information we've gathered so far, here's how we think it can be useful for you, and then sort of being part of that process as the program is being implemented and developed. So here are just a few key components, I guess, to what we're calling rapid cycle evaluation. First is really, which seems obvious, but it's really to evaluate the implementation and the impact of whatever the change is. And what benefit our role is in this process is really to include a counterfactual. So it's beyond just performance measurement, it's beyond just looking at outcomes, it's really adding in that piece of either what would it look like if this change had not taken place, or how does it compare to something else. So that we feel is really important in what value we add to that. Then as I just previously mentioned, the short-term feedback to program managers is really critical. It not only provides information as the program is being implemented, but it also makes sure that decisions, informed decisions are being made as the process continues. And so we often present at monthly meetings, weekly meetings, even at times, based on the information that we're collecting at the time. And then the third point really is the same in terms of the feedback loop. And I have here the evaluation changes. We do often, we set an evaluation plan, we have our design. We often don't change the design, but we do often have to modify our plan a little bit. It may be that we need to collect additional data that we hadn't planned to collect. It may be we have to track a different outcome or an additional outcome, but that's really why it's important to be involved from the planning stage and throughout the whole process. And then finally, as Scott and Alex both talked about, in terms of the data, what really supports sort of this rapid cycle or getting information back to the program managers quickly is relying fairly heavily on administrative data to the extent possible. And then also supplementing it with other information, survey information, qualitative data, things like that, but really relying heavily on that administrative data, which in New York City we have a lot of. So it makes it fairly easy. So I'm going to talk about, like I said, one particular example. So the example I'm going to talk about is an evaluation of an in-center pilot program for online applications for our SNAP. So what the program really was, HRA is sort of going through an entire business process re-engineering effort, moving people more towards, on the online environment. So this was one effort as part of that larger effort. And it was really to install computers within our offices for people who physically come to the office to apply for SNAP. Rather than seeing a worker, they would be encouraged to go to the computer bank, apply online. That in of itself is a change in procedure, but was really different was rather than seeing a worker that same day and doing their eligibility interview, they would go home after they submitted their online application, get a phone call from HRA to schedule an interview, and then they would do a telephone interview, eligibility interview. And so the other piece of that was people still had the option to do an in-person, paper application, but they no longer had the option of doing a same-day eligibility interview with a worker. They'd still have to go home and either come back another day or do a telephone interview. So that was really the pilot that we were trying to test. So the three main evaluation questions, we really focused on, we wanted to do an implementation evaluation as well as an impact evaluation. So the first question was really how did, the first and second question, how really did the pilot affect online applications? We expected online applications to go up, obviously, but we wanted to track that. And then second, how was the pilot received by the clients and the staff? Because it was a pretty major shift in what the staff was experiencing. They went from being interviewers to sort of a more facilitator model, and then the workers who were in the center who were no longer doing the in-person interviews were transferred to the telephone operation. So it was a pretty major shift for the staff. And then finally, what was the impact on SNAP acceptance and rejection rates, which really was the main outcome that the program area was interested in. So really we looked at 4 measures, just administrative data on the use of online applications. Second, what was the applicant experience? We used a few different methods. We did a survey of those who did the online application. We did an exit survey for the people who chose not to do the online application to find out why they didn't want to do the application online. And then we also did observations just to see how the pilot was running and if it was consistent with what the design of the pilot was. We also did a staff survey. We did a survey both of the staff who were still in the center that served as facilitators, and we did a survey of the staff who were transferred to the telephone operation. And then finally, we used administrative data to look at the outcomes of the application. And just to give you a sense of how things rolled out, there were 3 initial pilot centers in the summer of 2013, I guess it would be, or 13, right? And it expanded to 6 pilot centers. We focused initially on the first 3, then looked at the 6, but because it was a pilot, we were allowed to then compare it to the other centers. There's about 16 SNAP centers in New York City. So the design wasn't random assignment, which would have been pretty difficult, but it was a comparison group design. So the next few slides are the results, and I'm not going to go through all the results, but I just wanted to give everybody kind of an idea of what then we did present back to the program managers and how we helped informed how things moved forward. We did present the findings in kind of 3 stages. We had the client survey results first, then we had the staff survey, and then finally we had the outcomes. So just real briefly in terms of the results, the survey results were overwhelmingly positive to the online environment. They liked doing the online application. They liked not having to wait 2 hours to see a worker. So that was all fairly positive. And we also asked some questions about, could they have done the online application on their own, because ultimately that would be the goal, that they wouldn't even have to come into an office. We heard that, most of them, about 60%, said they actually did need some help. And we also, through our observations, found that the pilot was implemented as it had been planned. In terms of the staff survey, again, we presented some of the results. Here's some examples of the graphs where we just presented, the frequencies for each question. We found that the staff were fairly neutral, fairly indifferent to some of the changes. They didn't really feel strongly one way or the other. Some liked going to the telephone operation. Some felt that, they preferred the in-person. But overwhelmingly, it wasn't too strong. So the program managers took that as, that it was okay, that the staff were really okay with it. And then we also, as I mentioned, surveyed specifically the staff that had been transferred to the telephone operation and asked them about their environment, because it was such a shift going to a telephone operation from in-person, and then we presented those results. In terms of the outcomes, this we presented, it was the final presentation we did. It was about 5 months after the initial implementation of the pilot. So again, this sort of rapid cycle evaluation model. We wanted to get the results back very quickly. We did find a negative effect on SNAP receipt. There was a fairly large decline. Here's the graph that shows the decline. This is just comparing pre-pilot to post-pilot for the 3 pilot sites compared to all the other sites. And you can see, you know, the blue is the year prior, and the red is the summer that they implemented the change. Pretty dramatic decline in acceptance rates. And then we also wanted to show the people, that included all online applications because of some data limitations. We also wanted to show the people a year prior who applied in person through paper, how it compared to all the people coming in the prior year who normally, had things not changed, would have applied on paper, but now they were doing it online. And we saw even bigger differences. So this was pretty dramatic. And we went even further to try to figure out, well, why was there such a dramatic decline in the acceptance rates? And this graph shows really the reason why. The gray bar at the top is the percent that had no eligibility interview conducted. And so you can see, I guess that's all the way to the left was the year prior, and then the middle is the online applications. So about 18% had no interview conducted. So that really told us that, you know, because people had to apply online, then go home and do their eligibility interview later, that there was a drop-off there, which affected the acceptance rates. And this was just another way to illustrate that. And this was important because the program managers, you know, they were also sort of tracking their own data. They were just looking at outcomes. And they had noticed right away that after we had told them the rejection rates had gone up, they started looking at their own data, and they realized that the largest percentage of rejections were because of documents not being returned. So they initially thought, oh, well, it's a problem with documents. Well, we were able to go back in and say, well, actually, it was the largest percentage was always the documents weren't returned. But once this was implemented, it was the interviews not being conducted, which is what increased. And so then showing this graph to them really sort of highlighted that, oh, it wasn't the documents based on our outcome reporting, it really was something else. Okay, so just the implications, and I think this shows kind of the benefit of not only having the internal capacity to do this, but also the rapid nature of how, you know, quickly we could get feedback back to the program managers, was that we did share it within 5 months. You know, initially that dramatic reduction in acceptance rates was a little, you know, I think it was a little tough for the program managers to take, but they listened and they made some initial changes. They tried to identify, you know, what was going on, so they made some initial changes. And then we looked at it a few months later, and things didn't dramatically improve, so that's when they decided they really needed to stop the expansion and take a harder look at what was going on. And then just finally, sort of some lessons learned, and Scott and Alex sort of touched on a few of these things. But really the relationship with the program area is critical for doing this type of, you know, rapid cycle evaluation. We benefit because we have the capacity to have an internal team, but as Alex was saying, you can develop that with universities or with research firms, but that relationship really is critical. The involvement in the planning, as I talked about at the beginning, was also very critical because we knew exactly what was happening, what was being implemented, when it was being implemented, and it also informed some of the data issues that we discovered, you know, later, and we had to, you know, measure things a little differently than we initially thought. And then getting buy-in from the program area, being involved in that planning really helped them then taking ownership of the results in the end. Even though it wasn't, you know, the results were not positive, they felt that because they hadn't been involved in the design and in the planning of the evaluation, that it really was, you know, the results were really real. And then, you know, as I mentioned earlier, the constant feedback was critical. Being able to give them information 1 to 2 months after they first started implementation was very important. And then having that counterfactual was very, very important. Being able to compare it to the centers that had not had the pilot implemented was really what, you know, made them realize that this really did have a negative impact. It wasn't just a data issue. It wasn't just a timing issue. It had to be something else. And that's it. Thanks.
Okay, before we open it up for questions, I just want to just share with you some of the work that we're doing with and on behalf of OPRE. OPRE is really leading this charge in terms of getting this information out. We're planning under, I'm the project director at Mathematica for a project sponsored by OPRE called Advancing Welfare and Family Self-Sufficiency Research, and we call it Project Awesome because it truly is that. And under Project Awesome, the goal is to increase states' capacity, state and localities' capacities to both produce and use high-quality research. And so one of the activities we're doing under this is taking Alex's toolkit that she's developed for the Department of Education on opportunistic experiments and adapt it to the TANF world. And so we have real live examples, both the toolkit and the brief, to really be able to really pitch this work and to teach you, the researchers, the state-level program administrators, how to do this kind of evaluation. And I just want to, kind of caveat this with this kind of evaluation isn't, in particular with the opportunistic experiments, it's not a one-size-fits-all. You have to use the best method for what is needed. But with the right standards of rigor, it really can be used to produce good quality evidence to make good decisions. It'll never replace the gold standard in terms of, I always call the gold standard is the BMW of research, but it can be, with good standards of rigor, the Honda version of producing good information for states. So please let me know on the state level, state researchers and program administrators or local folks, let me know if you're interested in this. We're doing this work on an ongoing basis through OPRE, and we're very excited about it. So with that, I'm going to open it up for questions, if you have any, for the presenters. Bert.
Yes, a question for Angela. You noticed this large decline in the acceptance rate, and I was wondering whether you thought it was necessarily a bad thing, maybe it was a good thing. Was that in your logic model? Maybe you're going to accept fewer people who shouldn't have been accepted. I'm just curious.
What do I do?
I'll just repeat the question. Burr's just asking if, given the large decline in the rejection rates, if it ever came into our thought that maybe wasn't necessarily a negative, that it, could have been just that people coming in were not eligible. Yes, it did, and actually the program area, when they saw the initial results, I think immediately went to that. But the difference was that the people who were applying were people who, had we not made the change, would have applied on paper. So they would have applied under our old, the old process. And so we would have expected the acceptance rates to be the same. There really was no other change. I mean, timing, is a little, we were looking a year later, but really that was the only major change. So the eligibility should have been similar. So that was, that was sort of our thinking behind that.
Okay, other questions? Rob.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yep.
Hi, Rob Olson from Apt Associates. I've got also a question for Angela, which is, I had a little trouble interpreting the results of the findings. Maybe this is building on Bert's comment. I had a little trouble interpreting the results of the study because you never quite clarified what the purpose of the what HRA thought it was trying to accomplish in putting this self-service pilot in place. What was the intended goal? And maybe on the side, what were the possible unintended consequences that they were concerned about? But more specifically, what was the intended goal? What were you trying to accomplish?
Right. Sorry, yeah, I did sort of skip over that. So as part of the major re-engineering effort I mentioned, it's really to increase efficiencies as well as to improve the experience for the client. So in terms of improving efficiencies, it's obviously if you can move people towards more self-directed work, it's going to require less staff time. And then in terms of improving the client experience, they don't have to wait 3 hours in line at a center, they can do it online. So that was really that's the overarching purpose of moving people towards the online environment. Then in terms of your second question, the unintended consequences is exactly what we were measuring, which was the effect on the acceptance rates, because there was the concern that, okay, you can move all these people to an online environment, but if they're not getting benefits, then you may be increasing efficiencies, but you're hurting the client. So that was really, so I hope that clarified.
This is another take on the same issue. I've spent a lot of my life designing random assignment and application policies And placing the point of random assignment is a very delicate task. Place it too early and you'll get a low take-up rate. Place it too late and you'll get a lot of people dissatisfied and finding similar services elsewhere in many contexts. In doing this kind of work, one main principle I rely on is what Gary Burtis of the Brookings Institution used to call Cheston's chestnut, which indicates that every time you ask people to go home and come back, you lose a third. And so your results are no surprise to me, because in the past people got accepted the same day. Now they had to go home and come back, so you'll lose a fraction of them.
Yes, I agree. They were not a surprise to us either. But I think it's the fact that going through the process and really, I think it was really the magnitude of decline that was a little bit surprising, because we went into it, the program area went into it thinking people need benefits. And so you make it a little bit easier to apply, and then even the telephone interview's easier, so I don't think they expected quite that large of a decline. But you're right.
Barb.
I'm Barb Devaney from Mathematica. I've heard several presentations on rapid cycle evaluation recently, and one common theme across it is the use of administrative data, but one thing that I haven't heard very much talked about is the quality of the administrative data and what the issues are around it. Now, in Angela's case, I think we can be pretty confident about the quality of those data, but I just think it'd be good if maybe the other panelists, or even all three or whatever, commented on how that's a very important step and what are some best practices there.
Yeah,
I mean both the quality of the data as well as the ease of getting them.
Yeah, I mean, that's a critical point, that the quality of the data, you have to be confident that the outcomes that you're observing are actually, measuring what you want them to measure. So, ensuring the quality of the data is actually very critical. And I think for some programs like SNAP and TANF, when you look at administrative data, you can have more confidence in some of the information than in others, and really understanding which information in your administrative data set is reliable and which isn't is a critical first step to conducting one of these types of evaluations. I think that there are steps that agencies can take to improve the quality of the data. Really conducting an assessment early on is a first step towards doing that. Investing in higher quality data systems that collect administrative data with a little more ease, and that can, systems that can ensure data quality is another step. And then I think one of Barb's points is ensuring data linkages across programs. That's really, in the Utah example that I gave, Utah's administrative data system is set up to allow, a lot of, and other states as well, it's not just Utah, but a lot of linkages across administrative databases and other third-party databases that allow the type of verification of applicant information that they had. Being able to link to other program databases, whether it's other public assistance programs or other types of databases, can really improve the types of analysis that you can do with rapid cycle evaluation and the outcomes that you can look at. So.
And again, if I could quickly pitch one of the OPRE resources that they recently funded, a grant, it's a 5-year grant to Chapin Hall and some University of Chicago, some other partners, the Family Self-Sufficiency Data Center, and it's actually to help the data center will work with states to help improve their data quality. So it's definitely on the radar, and again, a resource that OPRE is aware of, and we're working in collaboration with the data center. So the opportunistic experiments, the data center, and then Scholars Network, and you can learn about that this afternoon if you want to go. So, but an issue, but again, another resource that OPRE is addressing. And
I believe if my contact information is on that presentation, if there's another concept of data governance that actually OMB recently maybe about 2 years ago now, released a document sort of defining data governance, and data governance is really around the rules of how you use data and who has authority over ensuring the quality of the data. So if folks email me, I can send you the link to, or you can Google the link to the OMB data governance document, but it's a useful resource. Sorry.
No, I was just going to add that, you know, I've spent many years working with our administrative data, and I still don't know, you know, all the limitations. So data quality can be an issue on administrative data, as it can be with survey data. But I just add to what Scott said that part of the benefits of having either the internal capacity or developing those relationships is you start to understand what the limitations are of the administrative data. So even what I presented it looked great and it looked clean, but there was actually a lot of work that had to go into, you know, producing those acceptance and rejection rates. Without, initially we had double counted, and, you know, so there were some issues there, but because we know the data so well, we were able to, you know, get around them. But it's definitely an issue that needs, you know, to be addressed, and people really need to be familiar with the administrative data before they can use it for this type of work.
So I agree with everything that Scott and Angela said. The one thing I want to add is that I think getting folks to look at the data in a new way, like getting people who are just used to seeing the test scores and assuming that they understand what they mean, or they understand what, you know, how those relate to their teacher quality or whatever, by putting different people in the room thinking about the data, I think it can move data quality a long way, because it starts to uncover what are the limitations, which maybe no one had thought about if they're not thinking about using these data to really evaluate things.
Other questions or comments? Okay.
That's interesting. We
Do you
did.
want to reset the question?
Sure. The question was there was difference in the difference, right, between the acceptance rates across the 3 pilot centers, and did we look at why that was? We did actually a little bit. We tried to look at the demographics of the population served by the 3 different centers. They were in 3 different boroughs in New York City and did serve different populations. So we attributed some of it to that, because we had some previous survey data on the use of online and the online technology, so it was a little bit of a different population that was using the online application. And then we also relied on some of our observations in terms of how it was introduced to people who came into the center, and tried to attribute a little bit of the difference for that. So for example, one of the centers that had the largest decline in acceptance rates, we really looked at, or we tried to get the program areas to look at how the workers at the center were introducing the online application, and really making it, you know, more of a choice as opposed to kind of a, you know, very aggressive nudge over there. Because the thinking was, if somebody needed to be motivated to do it online, they shouldn't have felt forced to do it, and that might affect sort of the process further down the line. So we did try to take a look at it, but there wasn't anything, you know, concrete that we could attribute it to.
Other questions or comments? I mean, there's definitely a lot of researchers in the room that are, you know, Bert and others, that comments when you hear some of the, any comments or thoughts? I got. The question was the comparison of Spanish versus English speakers.
We did not look at that in terms of outcomes. We did look at that, though, as a factor for why people were choosing the online application versus choosing the in-person worker interview, and we did find that it was correlated with, if they were a non-English speaker, they were more likely to go to the in-person interview. But we didn't look at it in terms of the rejection. That's one area where the quality of the administrative data is not quite as good to tell us, you know, what's the preferred language. So we use it occasionally, but yeah, the quality is not quite as good.
Other questions? Just one last comment. For those of you who are state program administrators or local program administrators, we want this session to not just be informational, but transformational. We want you to be up here in 2 years from now providing these presentations on the kinds of work like Angela's done and Kinsey, her colleague, have done. We want Sarah Marsh up here from Colorado. We're starting to work with them up here presenting on this. So please feel free to reach out to me or someone from OPRE. Mark Fuccello is the project officer for this, and let us help you think about this on the program side, on the research side, so that you can produce a good evidence to make decisions. So anything else? All right, let's go one more round of applause.